The sun came up over the small road of Thermopylae on August 11th, 480 BC, making long shadows on the rough rocks that would help decide what would happen to many groups of people. At this important time, the old world was about to see an amazing meeting between two completely different ways of life, where Spartan toughness would crash against the hugeness of the Persian Empire in a way that would be remembered through the years. To completely understand how big this day was, we must first learn about the reasons that led to this huge fight. Before we jump into this exciting trip through history, be sure to subscribe and comment below what time you're watching this video. Your participation helps keep the interest in the history that made our world alive. Xerxes, the great king of Persia, took over the throne after his father, Darius the First, died. He didn't just get an empire that went from India to Egypt. He also got a strong desire for revenge against the Greeks that had been felt by his family since the Persians lost at Marathon 10 years before. The young Persian king, after hearing stories of how his father was embarrassed by the Greeks, decided to gather what many people who study history think was the biggest army ever put together in old times. The guesses are different, but old writings talk about numbers reaching 2 million men. Even if that number is too high, it shows the huge size of this army trip. For years, Xerxes had gotten ready for this attack with extreme care. Bridges were built across the Hellespont to let his soldiers walk from Asia to Europe. A ditch was dug through the Mount Athos area to avoid the dangerous winds that had destroyed the Persian navy before. Places to store food and supplies were set up along the planned road, and Persian messengers visited Greek cities, offering good deals to give up easily in exchange for obeying them. Meanwhile, in the Greek city-states, the news of Persian preparations caused different feelings. Many communities, especially in northern Greece, chose to give up, offering land and water to the great king as signs of serving him. Other cities remained split, with their people arguing strongly about whether to fight or accept Persian rule. However, two cities remained strongly against being ruled by a foreign power, Athens and Sparta. Athens, the young democracy that had surprised the world by beating the Persians at Marathon, saw Xerxes' attack as a huge threat not only to its freedom, but to the whole idea of people ruling themselves. Sparta, for its part, thought any suggestion of giving up was a major breaking of everything they thought of as Spartan values. The very idea of bending the knee to a foreign king was impossible for a society that had built every part of its life around the ideas of honor, bravery, and freedom. The Spartan leader at this crucial time was Leonidas, a man who had become king not as a direct son, but through the complicated ways Spartans chose their leaders. At 60, Leonidas had lived his whole life following the strict Spartan soldier rules. From his training in the Agog to his army fights as a grown-up, he knew better than anyone what was at risk when Persian lookouts started showing up on the edges of Greece. The first Greek plan was big, to defend the Thermopylae road by land, while the Greek navy faced the Persian fleet at Cape Artemisium. Thermopylae was the smallest space between the mountains and the sea on the road Xerxes needed to take to get to the middle of Greece. Here, in theory, a small number of brave fighters could hold their own against a much bigger army. They would stop the Persians from using their huge numbers, which was their main strength. Leonidas left Sparta with only 300 specially chosen fighters, each one a full Spartan citizen, a tough fighter, and a father of sons. This last rule was not an accident. Leonidas knew they were going to die, and wanted to make sure the Spartan family lines would keep going. Along the way, other Greeks joined the group, including Tegeans, Mantineans, Thespians, and Thebans, making the total number about 7,000 men. When the Greeks arrived at Thermopylae, they found a place that seemed perfectly made for defense. The gap was so narrow in places that only a few people could walk side by side. Tall, steep rocks rose on one side, while on the other the sea crashed against sharp cliffs. An old wall built by the Phocians to protect themselves against the Thessalians went across the narrowest spot, and the Greeks immediately started fixing and making it stronger. As the Greeks got their defenses ready, Xerxes and his huge army slowly came closer. The Persian march was an amazing sight that was hard to imagine. Groups of soldiers from dozens of different countries marched under the empire's flags. Persian immortals with their golden spears, Median archers dressed in leather and bronze, Scythian horsemen from the flatlands, Egyptian soldiers with rough leather shields, Indian fighters armed with bamboo bows, and thousands of others showing every part of the empire. The Persian army's mix of people was both a good thing and a bad thing. While it gave them many different ways to fight and weapons, it also made it very hard to talk and work together. Different groups spoke different languages, followed different leaders, and often had little in common except that they all worked for the great king. In contrast, the small Greek army showed a shared goal rarely seen in army history. Even though they came from different city-states, all the Greeks at Thermopylae shared a common culture, a common language, and most importantly, a common will to protect their freedom against foreign rule. On the morning of August 11th, when the first Persian lookouts saw the Greek camp, what they saw must have been both encouraging and confusing. The Greeks were clearly small in number. Almost funny how few they were to defend a narrow road against the biggest army the world had ever seen. Yet there was something about the exact movements of the Greek soldiers, the total order in their camp, and the quiet confidence of their preparations that suggested these men would not be easily scared away. The Persian lookouts, experienced men who had watched armies in many lands, told Xerxes what they saw with growing surprise. The Greeks showed no signs of fear or getting ready to run away. Instead, they seemed to be carefully getting ready for a long fight, as if they truly believed they could stand up to the combined might of the whole Persian Empire. Xerxes, sure of his huge advantage in numbers, first thought the Greeks were just putting up a show of fighting back that would quickly disappear when they saw how powerful his army really was. He sent a messenger to the Greek lines with a generous offer: give up in exchange for good treatment and a respected place in the Persian Empire. The answer he got must have been surprising because it was so simple and final. Leonidas, speaking for all the Greeks there, flatly refused any chance of giving up. His answer, though polite, made it very clear. The Greeks had come to fight and would fight until the end. There were no ways they would think about giving up, no deals they could make, no middle ground between freedom and being slaves. This complete refusal forced Xerxes to face something his past experiences hadn't prepared him for. In all his army campaigns, in all the lands he had taken over, there had always been a point where fighting turned into talking, where the fear of being destroyed was stronger than the wish for freedom. Here at Thermopylae, for the first time, he faced men for whom death was better than shame. The great king decided to give the Greeks a few days to think again about their position, hoping that the continued sight of his massive army would finally convince even the most stubborn fighters that trying to fight was pointless. During this time, more Persian lookouts watched the Greeks, and their reports became more and more interesting and worrying. The Spartans, in particular, acted in ways that the Persians couldn't understand. Instead of spending their days in worried preparations or begging the gods, they went about their normal routines with an almost unnatural calm. They exercised their bodies, took care of their weapons and armor, and most surprisingly, many were seen carefully combing their long hair. This last action especially confused Persian watchers. In a culture where getting ready for death often meant complicated crying rituals and spiritual preparation, the sight of fighters combing their hair as if getting ready for a party, not a deadly battle, was almost impossible to understand. A Greek prisoner caught by the Persians explained that Spartans traditionally paid special attention to their looks before facing deadly danger. It was a tradition from hundreds of years of Spartan culture based on the belief that a man should meet death with respect and looking good. For the Spartans, facing battle with messy hair would have been a kind of fear, a denial of their own humanity when facing danger. This explanation, far from making the Persians feel better, only made their worry worse. They were used to fighting enemies who were motivated by wanting more, wanting land, or even by strong religious belief. reasons that could be understood, worked with, or finally defeated. Here, however, they met men motivated by ideas completely foreign to the Persian experience. The idea that being human itself required fighting against being ruled, no matter what happened next. Days passed, and the tension in the Persian camp grew noticeably. Soldiers who had walked proudly through Asia Minor and Thrace now whispered among themselves about the strange Greeks who showed no fear. Officers who had conquered cities and defeated whole nations found themselves confused by a small group of men who seemed to think of coming death as nothing more than a normal part of their lives. Xerxes, becoming more and more frustrated by the situation, called his helpers to talk about different ways to fight. Some suggested going around Thermopylae completely, sending part of the army by sea to attack the Greeks from behind. Others suggested trying harder with talking, perhaps offering even better deals or clearer threats. However, the very nature of the situation made these other ideas difficult. Xerxes had put too much into this attack, both in money and in the great name of the empire, to accept any answer that did not clearly show Persian power. Allowing a small group of Greeks to set the terms of the fight, even in a roundabout way, would set a dangerous example that could encourage fighting back in other parts of the empire. More importantly, Xerxes was beginning to understand that he was facing something deeper than just normal army resistance. The Greeks were not just defending land or money. They were defending a way of life they thought was naturally better than what the Persian Empire offered. For them, giving up to a foreign king meant not only a political loss, but a spiritual destruction. As more information came about Greek preparations, Persian lookouts reported details that showed the amazing strength of the Spartan will. The Greeks had set up a system where groups took turns to make sure their defenses were always alert. They had organized their food not for a short stay, but for a long fight. Most importantly, they had set up daily habits that suggested they saw their situation not as a quick problem, but as a new way of life. These habits included regular gifts to the gods, tough physical exercises, and practice sessions that seemed designed not only to keep them ready for battle, but also to make the group stronger and reinforce their shared goal. The Persians noticed that the Greeks showed none of the psychological stress that usually affects soldiers under long periods of pressure. Instead, they seemed truly comfortable with their situation, as if they had finally found the purpose for which they had trained all their lives. The moment that truly helped the Persians understand the situation came when Xerxes sent Hydarnes, commander of his best immortal soldiers, for one last try at talking. Hydarnes was a man with a lot of skill in both talking and fighting, someone who had successfully talked with resistance leaders in other campaigns. His job was to offer the Greeks extremely good terms, not only life and freedom, but also respected positions in the Persian army and profitable jobs as governors in conquered lands. Leonidas received Hydarnes politely, but his answer was even more final than his refusals before. He explained that the Persians did not understand the true nature of the situation. The Greeks were not at Thermopylae because they expected to win in the normal way, nor because they were trying to negotiate better terms. They were there because they believed that some things were more important than individual lives, and that the freedom of their people was one of those things. More deeply, Leonidas explained an idea completely new to Persian thinking. He suggested that the Persians, for all their power and wealth, were basically slaves of their own king. The Greeks, on the other hand, even though they might die at Thermopylae, would die as free men defending a society of free men. This freedom, he argued, made each single Greek more powerful than any Persian subject, no matter their rank or wealth. This conversation was told back to Xerxes in details that must have been very unsettling to the great king. For the first time in his life, he met people who rejected not only his power, but the very rightness of the idea of total imperial power. The Greeks were not simply being stubborn or misinformed. They were standing up for a completely different way of looking at the world. The Persian lookouts, continuing their observations, reported other things about Greek preparedness that showed how deep their commitment was. The Spartans had sent messengers back to their cities, not to ask for more soldiers or supplies, but to make sure that their families understood and approved of their actions. These messengers returned not with pleas to change their minds, but with messages of pride and encouragement. Most significantly, the Greeks had begun setting up temporary monuments, not for themselves, as they hoped their bodies would stay at Thermopylae, but to make sure that their actions would be properly remembered by future generations. They had begun carving words into the rocks, not sad goodbyes or farewells, but simple statements of their goal that explained why they had chosen to fight and die there. One such carving seen by Persian lookouts and later reported throughout the army ranks would be especially memorable. A simple statement that the men present had obeyed the laws of their cities. To outside observers, especially Persians used to worshipping the king as a god, this mention of laws as the highest authority was nearly impossible to understand. The Greeks apparently got their power not from a godlike king, but from abstract rules they themselves had created and chosen to follow. As the 11th of August went on, the growing Persian understanding of the situation began to affect the morale of their own troops. Soldiers who had expected a quick show of imperial power found themselves facing a complex mind puzzle. On one hand, Persian numerical superiority was so overwhelming that winning the battle seemed certain. On the other, the nature of Greek resistance suggested that even winning the battle would not achieve the political and psychological goals of the campaign. The Persians had built their empire on the idea that all peoples, when faced with enough power, would eventually choose to give up rather than be destroyed. This idea had been true throughout decades of the empire getting bigger. At Thermopylae, however, they met a people for whom the choice between giving up and destruction was not really a choice at all, for they considered giving up a form of destruction even worse than physical death. Persian commanders began to worry about the effect the coming fight might have on their own troops. Many soldiers in the Persian army were hired fighters or support troops from conquered lands, men who fought for money, force, or personal loyalty to local leaders. Faced with enemies who clearly fought for completely different reasons, some began to question the nature of their own part in the campaign. Even more troubling, some of the Persian soldiers who were of Greek origin, and there were many in Xerxes' army, began showing signs of worry. These men had joined the Persians for different reasons, taking chances, being forced, or a real belief that Persian rule offered a better future than a split-up, free Greece. The sight of Greeks willing to die rather than accept exactly what they themselves had accepted created a lot of mental discomfort. Xerxes, sensing these worried feelings in his army, made a crucial decision. He could no longer let the situation drag on forever. For each extra day of fighting gave the Greeks more chances to show that the Persians were not unbeatable, and gave his own soldiers more time to think about the bigger philosophical meanings of the fight. On the afternoon of August 11th, the great king finally ordered his archers to begin a massive shower of arrows on the Greek positions. This decision was a big step up as it moved the conflict past talking and scaring to direct army violence. However, even this decision showed how much the Greeks had influenced Persian thinking about strategy. Normally, the Persians liked to start campaigns with horsemen or foot soldiers attacking, which dramatically showed their army power and offered chances for the enemy to give up with honor. The use of archers as a first move suggested that Xerxes had concluded that the Greeks would not surrender. No matter how hopeless their army situation became, the Greeks responded to the arrow attack in a way that only proved the Persian judgments about their amazing will. Instead of finding cover or showing fear, they simply raised their shields in formation and continued their preparations as if the arrows were nothing more than inconvenient rain. Some Spartans were seen joking about how the Persian arrows would block the sun, letting them fight in the shade. This response to the arrow attack was perhaps the moment when the Persian lookouts finally fully understood the nature of their opponents. The Greeks were not pretending to be brave or keeping up a show of boldness. They truly did not seem worried about coming death. For them, apparently the question was not whether they would die, but whether they would die in a way that honored their values and inspired others to uphold the same principles. As the afternoon wore on, more Persian groups were brought to the front line, and the size of the arrow attack grew dramatically. The air over the pass literally darkened with the huge number of arrows, creating a sight that must have been both grand and terrifying. Yet the Greeks held their positions with a discipline that impressed even their enemies. Persian lookouts watching from the back lines reported that the Greeks had developed a system of taking turns that allowed different groups to rest while others held the defenses. Even more impressive, they continued their normal routines even under the arrow attack, with some soldiers seen exercising, others sharpening weapons, and still others having seemingly casual conversations. This normality under extreme pressure was perhaps the most confusing part of Greek behavior. The Persians were used to enemies who responded to danger with complicated rituals, desperate pleas to the gods, or at least clear signs of stress and fear. The Greeks seemed to have accepted the possibility of violent death so completely into their way of life that it caused no abnormal mental stress. As the day went on, it became clear that the arrow attack, though huge, was not giving the desired results. The Greeks had positioned themselves to get the most protection from the land, and their careful defense kept the actual injuries low. More importantly, there were no signs that the attack was weakening their will or creating conditions for surrender. Xerxes, faced with the lack of success of his first army attempt, called his commanders together for a discussion. The available choices were limited by the nature of the land and the Greek demonstration that normal tactics of fear were useless. A straight-on attack through the pass would be possible, but costly in Persian lives and uncertain in result due to the Greek defensive advantages. During these discussions, Persian lookouts provided extra reports that only confirmed their analysis that the Greeks would not break under mental pressure. They had seen Leonidas and other Greek leaders calmly checking their defenses, apparently discussing small changes in fighting rather than strategies of escape or giving up. The behavior of the Greek leaders suggested long-term planning, not fixing an emergency. More significantly, the Persians had caught some Greek messengers and found out that messages with other Greek cities consisted not of desperate pleas for help, but of factual reports on the situation and statements that they would keep fighting. These messages treated the army situation as if it was simply another normal part of Greece's long history of defending freedom. As the sun began to set on August 11th, Xerxes made the decision to launch a small attack by foot soldiers to test the Greek defenses directly. This decision was another big step up, moving the fight from shooting arrows from far away to close combat. The groups chosen for this test attack were experienced, but not the best troops. They were soldiers capable of giving a realistic assessment of Greek defensive capability without risking the best Persian troops. The attack was launched shortly before sunset, when the fading light would create extra problems for the Greek defenders. Several hundred Persian soldiers advanced through the gap in an organized way, hoping that the superior numbers and force of the attack would create at least a hole in the Greek lines. What followed was a display of military skill that surprised even seasoned Persian observers. The Greeks not only stood firm against the attack, but did so with a technical efficiency that showed decades of special training. Their phalanx formation worked exactly as planned, creating a solid wall of spears and shields that forced the Persian attackers into set killing zones. Even more impressive, the Greeks showed a coordination that suggested not only better individual training, but also a deep group understanding of how to defend. They moved as one single body, each soldier reacting instantly to changes in attack pressure without the need for spoken orders. This perfect timing was the result of a soldier culture that emphasized group order over individual bravery. The Persian attack, though brave and determined, was pushed back with significant losses and little ground gained. More importantly, for Persian observers, the Greeks showed the same calm during the fight they had displayed during their preparations. There were no war cries, panic, or signs of stress from fighting. They fought with a professional efficiency that suggested they viewed the battle as simply another aspect of their normal military responsibilities. After the attack, Persian lookouts reported that the Greeks quickly reorganized their defenses, treated their wounded, and resumed their normal routines as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. This response to actual combat provided final confirmation that the earlier Persian judgments were correct. These men genuinely would not be broken by normal army pressure. As darkness fell over Thermopylae, Xerxes was faced with the realization that he had encountered something completely new in his army experience. The Greeks had shown that they were not simply brave soldiers defending a strong place. They were representatives of a civilization that had developed ideas of value and purpose fundamentally different from those that sustained the Persian Empire. This realization created a profound strategic problem for the Persian command. On one hand, eliminating the Greeks was clearly possible, given enough time and a willingness to accept significant losses. On the other hand, the very process of eliminating such determined resistance would send messages throughout the Greek world and beyond that could weaken rather than strengthen the Persian position in the long term. The Persian lookouts in their final reports of the day described the Greeks in terms that revealed the profound impact the confrontation had had on the observers themselves. They spoke of men who seemed to have overcome the normal limits of fear and self-preservation, not through religious madness or despair, but through a philosophical commitment to abstract principles. This description represented a fundamental challenge to the assumptions underlying the entire Persian imperial structure. The empire had been built on the idea that all peoples ultimately valued survival and material prosperity above abstract ideals. The Greeks at Thermopylae demonstrated that at least some cultures had developed completely different value systems. As August 11th, 480 BC came to an end, Persian lookouts had provided Xerxes with a report that would change his understanding not only of the immediate army campaign, but of the nature of the cultural resistance his empire would face as it attempted to expand into the Greek world. The Greeks at Thermopylae had demonstrated that they represented more than a temporary army obstacle. They were a manifestation of an alternative way of organizing human society, one that produced men willing to die for concepts like freedom, honor, and self-determination. This demonstration would be remembered not only by the Persians who witnessed it, but by generations of observers who would understand that August 11th, 480 BC marked the moment when two completely different worlds directly confronted each other. The impact of this confrontation would extend far beyond the immediate army result. The Persian lookouts had witnessed the birth of a legend that would inspire resistance to imperial rule for centuries to come. More importantly, they had observed the practical demonstration that some human societies could produce individuals for whom freedom was literally more important than life, a lesson that would resonate throughout history whenever people faced the choice between independence and submission. This was the day the Persian lookouts realized that the Spartans, and by extension the Greek civilization they represented, would never break the way other peoples had. It was a discovery that redefined not only immediate military strategy, but also Persian understanding of human nature and the possibilities of cultural resistance. During the night that followed, as both armies settled down, the implications of the day began to spread through the entire Persian army leadership. Officers who had served in dozens of previous campaigns found themselves discussing aspects of Greek behavior that they could not explain through their previous experience. Spartan discipline was not simply better army training. It was an expression of an entirely different philosophy of life. Lookout reports were shared among Persian commanders overnight, starting discussions that showed how deep the challenge the Greeks posed was. Some officers argued that the apparent Greek calm was simply a show that would fall apart under continuous army pressure. Others, particularly those with experience in previous campaigns against Greek peoples, suggested that the observed behavior was consistent with broader cultural patterns that made the Greeks fundamentally different from other peoples conquered by the empire. This second perspective was particularly unsettling because it suggested that even a complete army victory at Thermopylae might not achieve the invasion's broader strategic goals. If the Greeks were genuinely willing to die rather than accept Persian rule, then the conquering of Greece would require not just army defeat, but the complete killing of entire populations, a prospect that presented enormous difficulties in moving supplies and in politics. As the night went on, more reports arrived from other parts of Greece that confirmed Persian concerns. Greek cities that had not yet been directly threatened were gathering their people, not to talk or prepare for surrender, but for active army resistance. This gathering suggested that the Spartan example at Thermopylae was inspiring. Rather than discouraging broader Greek resistance, even more worrying, intercepted Greek messages revealed that the position at Thermopylae was being deliberately used as a symbol of all Greek resistance. The Greeks were consciously changing the confrontation into something larger than a single army battle. They were creating a story of defending their way of life that could inspire resistance for generations. Xerxes, confronted with this information during the hours before dawn, began to realize that he had seriously underestimated the nature of the Greek challenge. His first plan had been based on the idea that the Greeks, like all other peoples, would eventually figure out that the costs of fighting back outweighed the benefits of independence. The events of August 11th demonstrated that the Greeks operated on a completely different calculation. For the Spartans and their allies, the question was not whether they could win in a battle. They clearly understood that they could not. The question was whether they could demonstrate that some values were more important than individual survival, and whether this demonstration would inspire other Greeks to continue their resistance even after the fall of Thermopylae. This perspective transformed every moment of successful resistance into a strategic victory, regardless of the final tactical outcome. The Persian lookouts, resuming their observations at dawn on August 12th, reported that the Greeks had used the night hours, not for rest or desperate preparations, but for activities that suggested continued confidence in their purpose. Some soldiers had written additional messages on the rocks, others had conducted quiet religious rituals, and many had simply carried on normal conversations as if in a routine military camp. This continued normality under extraordinary circumstances provided the Persians with additional insight into Greek psychology. The Spartans apparently did not view their situation as an unusual emergency, requiring extreme emotional response. For them, defending fundamental principles to the death was simply a logical extension of how they had lived their entire lives. The impending battle represented not a deviation from their normal values, but their culmination. As preparations for the second day of fighting began, Xerxes made decisions that reflected his growing understanding of the situation. He ordered additional units to the front, not because he expected the Greeks to surrender in the face of further force, but because he had accepted that eliminating Greek resistance would require sustained massive force. Simultaneously, he sent orders to other Persian commanders in the region to intensify their efforts to find alternative routes through the mountains. This decision reflected recognition that while the Greeks might eventually be defeated at Thermopylae, the cost of a straight-on victory might be too high to justify, especially given that other Greek cities would likely offer similar resistance. During the morning of August 12th, Persian lookouts observed that the Greeks had made minor adjustments to their defensive positions based on lessons from the previous fight. These adjustments demonstrated not only tactical competence, but also an ability to learn and adapt under pressure, another indication that the Greek resistance was not the product of desperation or blind religious fervor, but of disciplined military professionalism. Most significantly, the Greeks began implementing tactics that seemed designed not only to maximize their chances of survival, but also to maximize the Persian cost of each advance. They had reorganized their defenses to create overlapping kill zones, established fallback positions that would allow for layered resistance, and assigned specific units to ensure that no Persian soldier who broke through their lines would survive to report detailed tactical information. These preparations revealed another aspect of the Greek mentality that defied Persian understanding. The defenders were not simply trying to prolong their own lives. They were systematically trying to make their eventual defeat as costly as possible to the attackers. This approach suggested strategic planning that extended beyond the immediate battlefield to consider the long-term effects on Persian morale and army capability. When Xerxes ordered the second major attack launched during the morning of August the 12th, the results confirmed the concerns raised by the Persian lookouts. The Greeks not only stood firm against the attack, but did so in a manner that demonstrated tactical improvements based on the previous day's experience. Their defense was more efficient, more coordinated, and more deadly to the attackers. During this second major fight, Persian observers noted aspects of Greek behavior that provided additional insights into their motivation. Wounded Greek soldiers who could no longer fight effectively continued to contribute to the defensive effort in any way possible, passing on information, reorganizing supplies, or simply offering verbal encouragement. This continued participation of soldiers who could not fight suggested a level of group commitment that went beyond normal army discipline. Even more impressive, the Greeks demonstrated during the intense combat an ability to maintain effective tactical communication and make coordinated decisions under extreme pressure. Their phalanx formation not only remained intact throughout the attack, but also dynamically adapted to changes in combat pressure without losing cohesion or effectiveness. This tactical flexibility indicated training that went far beyond basic army practice. After the second attack, Persian lookouts reported that the Greeks resumed their normal routines with a speed that defied belief. Soldiers who had spent hours in deadly combat quickly reorganized their positions, tended to the wounded, and a few hours later were observed engaged in casual activities, as if the intense combat were simply a minor interruption in their daily lives. This ability to quickly switch between extreme combat and casual normality suggested a mental conditioning the Persians had not previously encountered. Most soldiers after intense combat show signs of stress, emotional tiredness, or at least a need for a recovery period. The Greeks seem to have integrated the violence of combat so thoroughly into their identity that it created no lasting mental harm. During the afternoon of August 12th, information reached the Persian camp that changed the understanding of the situation from an army challenge to a potential strategic crisis. Messengers from other parts of Greece reported that the resistance at Thermopylae was inspiring army gathering in cities that had previously considered surrender. The Spartan demonstration that resistance was possible, even against impossible odds, was starting a pan-Hellenic, all-Greek response that could transform the entire Persian invasion. More worryingly, reports indicated that the Greeks were using the resistance at Thermopylae as a tool for recruiting and spreading their message. The story of the battle was being told throughout Greece not as a desperate tragedy, but as an inspiring example of what free men could achieve through unity and determination. This story was attracting volunteers from previously neutral cities and strengthening the resolve of communities that had hesitated to resist. Xerxes, faced with evidence that Spartan resistance was having strategic effects far beyond Thermopylae, called a war council to evaluate options. The discussions revealed deep divisions among his commanders over how to proceed. Some argued for a massive increase in the attack to quickly end Greek resistance and eliminate its message's value. Others suggested that each additional day of fighting at Thermopylae strengthened the Greek position, regardless of the final outcome. During these discussions, Persian lookouts provided additional reports that deepened their understanding of the situation. They observed that the Greeks were consciously creating symbols and habits that would transform their resistance into a lasting legend. Additional carvings had appeared on the rocks, some apparently intended not for the people of that time, but for future generations who would visit the battle site. These carvings revealed an aspect of the Greek mentality that was particularly confusing to the Persians. The defenders were not focused exclusively on the immediate combat, but also on the legacy they would leave behind. They were consciously planning their resistance as an example to inspire future resistance, transforming each additional day of fighting into an investment in long-term Greek freedom. Most significantly, the Greeks had begun writing down not only their own actions, but also Persian tactics and behavior, This documentation suggested that they viewed the confrontation as a learning opportunity that would provide valuable information for future Greek defensive campaigns. Even in the face of certain defeat, they were gathering intelligence that could benefit other Greeks later. As August 13th dawned, the situation had evolved from a simple army confrontation to a complex cultural and political challenge. Persian lookouts now reported not only Greek army movements, but also growing evidence that the resistance at Thermopylae was transforming into a phenomenon that went beyond its immediate army importance. The Greeks had begun to receive messengers from other cities, not asking them to withdraw or negotiate, but offering material support and promises that their resistance would not be forgotten. These messages transformed what could have been an isolated last stand into a center of resistance, connected to the broader network of Greek resolve. More importantly, the messengers brought news that other Greek forces were gathering, not to rescue the defenders of Thermopylae, but to continue their resistance elsewhere. The Greeks were turning the defense of Thermopylae into the first phase of a protracted resistance campaign that could continue indefinitely across Greek territory. This strategy of layered resistance presented a fundamental challenge for the Persians. Even if they could eliminate the resistance at Thermopylae quickly, they would face a series of similar engagements throughout Greece. Each subsequent battle would be influenced by the Spartan example, potentially making each encounter more difficult than the last. During the morning of August 13th, Xerxes made a decision that reflected his growing understanding of the complexity of the situation. He ordered a massive increase in attacks against the Greek positions, but simultaneously increased efforts to find an alternative route through the mountains. This dual approach recognized that while eliminating Greek resistance was necessary, prolonging the confrontation indefinitely could be counterproductive. The intensified attack launched during the morning of August 13th involved multiple waves of different troops designed to test every aspect of the Greek defenses and force the defenders to use up their physical and material resources. The Persians hoped that sustained army pressure would eventually reveal the limits of Greek resistance, even if that resistance was genuinely motivated by principle rather than hope of victory. However, the Greek response to the intensified attack confirmed the Persian lookout's earlier judgments. The defenders not only maintained their resistance, but continued to demonstrate the same discipline and efficiency they had displayed in the previous days. Most significantly, they appeared to have anticipated the Persian intensification and made specific preparations to withstand the increased pressure. During the prolonged fighting of August 13th, Persian observers noted that the Greeks had implemented a system of taking turns that allowed different units to rest while others held the defenses. This organization suggested planning for long-term resistance that went beyond the normal capabilities of a small defensive force. The Greeks had transformed their position into an efficient war machine that could function indefinitely within the limits of its provisions. Most impressively, the Greeks continued to demonstrate tactical innovation even under extreme pressure. They introduced new defensive techniques during combat, adapted their formations to respond to different types of Persian attack, and coordinated their actions with a precision that suggested near telepathic communication between units. This continuous adaptation was particularly frustrating for Persian commanders because it meant that any tactic that achieved some success quickly became useless as the Greeks developed countermeasures. The Greek ability to learn and adapt in real time transformed what should have been a series of progressively more successful attacks into a series of renewed tactical challenges. After the third day of intense fighting, Persian lookouts provided reports confirming that the Greeks had achieved something that seemed militarily impossible. They had transformed a desperately disadvantaged position into a situation where they were able to inflict significant losses on the attackers while keeping their own losses to a sustainable level. This transformation was not the result of Persian luck or error, but a product of superior preparation, exceptional discipline, and, most importantly, a value system that made each individual defender more effective than comparable Persian soldiers. The Greeks fought not only with their skills and weapons, but with the force-multiplying power of absolute conviction in their purpose. During the night of August 13th to 14th, news reached the Persian camp that transformed the entire dynamic of the situation. Ephialtes, a local Greek, offered to lead a Persian force along a mountain trail that would allow an attack on the Greek positions from the rear. This offer provided the Persians with exactly the tactical solution they had sought, but it also confirmed that eliminating Greek resistance would require extraordinary measures. The existence of the secret trail revealed that the Greeks had chosen to defend a position they knew could eventually be overcome. This choice suggested that their goal had never been army victory in the normal sense, but rather a demonstration of principle that would inspire broader Greek resistance. They had knowingly accepted an untenable army situation because their purpose was political and cultural, rather than tactical. This revelation provided the Persian lookouts with a final understanding of the Greek mentality. The Spartans and their allies were not desperate soldiers making a heroic last stand. They were cultural revolutionaries, demonstrating that free men could resist imperial power through conscious sacrifice. Their resistance was a form of political communication directed not only at the Persians but at the entire Greek world and beyond. Xerxes, informed of the trail and its significance, faced a complex strategic dilemma. On one hand, using the trail would allow for the rapid elimination of Greek resistance and the continuation of the invasion. On the other hand, doing so would confirm that the Greeks had successfully forced the Persians to resort to extraordinary resources to eliminate a small defensive force. This confirmation could be interpreted as a Greek victory, even in defeat. More problematic, using the trail would require dividing the Persian forces and coordinating a complex attack through difficult terrain. Any difficulty or delay in this operation would provide the Greeks with additional opportunities to demonstrate their resolve and create additional symbols of resistance. The very complexity required to defeat the Greeks testified to their effectiveness as a defensive force. During the early hours of August 14th, as Hydarnes led a select force of immortals up the mountain trail, Persian lookouts observed that the Greeks had detected or suspected the flanking maneuver. However, their response was not panic or attempted escape, but a calm reorganization of their defenses to face attack from two directions. This response to the imminent threat of being surrounded provided the ultimate demonstration of Greek discipline and determination. Faced with a situation that made defeat not only likely but mathematically certain, they simply adjusted their tactics to maximize the effectiveness of their final stand. There was no discussion of surrender, negotiation, or escape, only professional preparation to continue fighting under even more difficult conditions. The Greeks began implementing tactics that had clearly been designed for this very eventuality. They moved their forces to create defenses in multiple directions, established last-ditch positions at the narrowest point of the pass, and began rituals that suggested preparation for heroic death rather than army survival. These rituals included final gifts to the gods, distribution of personal belongings to ensure they reached families, and the creation of additional symbols that would document their sacrifice for future generations. The Greeks were consciously transforming their impending death into a political work of art that would inspire resistance through subsequent centuries. As August 14th dawned, Persian lookouts watched the final phase of the Greek resistance with a mixture of admiration and incomprehension that would define Persian perception of the confrontation. The Greeks faced their end with the same discipline and determination they had displayed throughout the battle, transforming even their defeat into a moral victory that would resonate throughout history. The last Spartan stand, observed by Persian lookouts from positions around the battlefield, provided the final demonstration that some men genuinely valued abstract principles more than individual lives. This demonstration redefined Persian understanding of the possibilities of human resistance and set a precedent that would influence conflicts between empires and free peoples for thousands of years to come. The Persian lookouts had witnessed the birth of a legend that would transcend its specific army origins to become a universal symbol of resistance to tyranny. More importantly, they had observed a practical demonstration that some cultures could produce men willing to die for freedom, a lesson that would forever change the dynamic between imperial power and national self-determination. This story of Thermopylae teaches us that, with the help of God, moments of great courage and sacrifice can transform the course of human history. The determination of the Spartans and the insight of the Persian lookouts that August of 480 BC were special tools that help preserve the freedom and values we still cherish in our Western civilization today.